So this evening, the 24th of August, 2022, we are looking for the second week at this sixth point of mind training, which is entitled The Commitments of Mind Training. At least that's one of the translations. And as I mentioned last week, it's a list of, so I have it off, of don'ts. A few other ones, but mainly, don't rely on a sense of duty, don't lash out, don't wait in ambush, don't go for the throat, don't be competitive, don't make a practice a sham, and so on. And just, again, setting some context, most of these really speak to some of the specifics that might be difficult in really putting into practice what was brought to us primarily in the first 3 points. So it's important not to, you can get lost in these and the real heart of the teachings is in those first 3 points. And I just want to kind of underscore the importance. If you're making the practice of lojong a really a way of approaching life in various ways, that the preliminary practices, the meditation instructions, the instructions on the exchange of self and others, Tonglen practice, the idea of actually taking adversity as opportunity rather than something to try to avoid, of recognizing that we roll all blames into our identification with the grasping and the aversion. We identify with it. We think we're the one that wants and doesn't want and judges and criticizes and condemns, and this slogan and the practice in general says, no, those are just things that are arising. And you're identifying with them and making up the idea that there's a self there based on that. And it is that identification that gives rise to the suffering that we experience. And so we begin to identify more with that spacious knowing that we were touching a bit in the meditation. Then there is, be grateful to everyone and everything. Again, the aggravating aspects that arise, very often connected with someone or another, are really opportunities. And I was talking with someone earlier today who had this real epiphany, had an old relationship that just really, a lot of difficult feelings arose around it. And she reached a point where she was being present to someone else's suffering, and she recognized the real deep wisdom and compassion that she had gained from dealing with that relationship. And she suddenly was, or so she said, was really overcome with gratitude for having had that very difficult experience. So, being grateful to everyone and everything. At first hearing sounds a little ridiculous, but as you really practice more deeply, it gives us these opportunities to know ourselves better, to be more compassionate to those around us because of that awareness. So gratitude's pretty natural. Then there's the aspect of, greatest protection is emptiness, the one with the four kayas, to see everything that arises as emanations of the unborn mind, like rays of the sun, that manifest in various ways, beautiful and ugly, gives a different perspective that can, the adversity no longer is really there, and there's nothing that needs to be protected when you're in that space, so to speak. So there's others in that third point, but there, and then, so there's kind of the heart of the practice right there. And if you are practicing in that way, then lashing out, don't lash out, is kind of like, well, yeah, of course, don't lash out. Don't go for the throat. Don't make the practice a sham. In other words, don't get all puffed up about, I'm a great practitioner and so forth. And well, of course not, you'd say to yourself. I think the real value to looking at each of those, and I hope everyone does at least read through about them, is that I think very often when we're doing them, we don't know it. We don't think we're lashing out, or we don't think that we're, being at all arrogant about our spiritual practice. But if we keep our awareness of our motivation, especially, at a high level, and are willing to be non-defensive about how we're doing in the world, then sometimes it's helpful to look at these slogans that seem at face value so well. So of course, why do they even write that in there? Of course. So do read them if you haven't already. Pema does a good job. I'm going to read tonight a little bit from Alan Wallace and Trelig also, about a couple of them. And the first one I want to talk about is the 28th slogan. I think it's the 28th. Give up any hope for results, is the way it's translated here. As I mentioned last time, Alan Wallace, I think, is pretty good for these sections, and he translates that abandon all hope of reward. Give up all hope of results. In Jamkin Control's book, his point on that is, he sort of puts a parenthesis after. Give up any hope for results that concern your own welfare, which is an aspect of it that is, I think, valuable. What Alan Wallace has to say about it is this. This aphorism can be understood in different ways. For starters, it advises us to abandon all hopes of gaining status, respect, fame, magical powers, and other mundane rewards in this life. From the highest perspective, it means we are finally to abandon even the hope of enlightenment, which is kind of a question that would naturally arise. Why are we practicing if we're not hoping that things might be different down the road in some way, As long as we are still caught in the dualistic mindset of viewing ourselves as deluded sentient beings struggling to achieve something we don't have, that very mentality, together with its hopes for enlightenment and fear of failure, obstructs our realization of our own Buddha nature, which is already present. The underlying context of this line is that the hopes and aspirations important at the beginning of spiritual practice become more of a present reality and less an abstract objective as one progresses in practice. As practice takes root and begins to nourish us from within, giving us fulfillment, well-being, and happiness in the present, and hopefully we've all experienced some of that, even in the ebb and flow of the difficulties of life. And our practice does bring us some of that. The practice becomes its own reward. When is your practice getting off the ground? When you start to enjoy it. Sounds a little bit like Pema Chodron there, I think. As you find satisfaction and joy arising from practice itself, then it is time to release the hope for rewards or accomplishments. As Dharma practice progresses, hope of reward is unnecessary, even detrimental. Therefore, let go of hope itself. This does not mean we should be hopeless, which I think is the direction some people take this and are confused by it. It means we can move beyond the dichotomy of hope and anxiety, or hope and fear. There are some deeply spiritual people that have made quotes about hope, about how important it is, and it's looking at things in two different perspectives. But ultimately, hope means things aren't okay as they are at the moment, or you wouldn't have hope that they'd be different. So hope is saying things are not okay. And the fears that arise are thinking, well, things aren't going to be okay in the future either. So there's hope and fear. One is saying things aren't okay, and the other one is saying they're not going to be okay. And from that perspective, we want to release that, to abandon hope of reward. And one's mind might say, well, sometimes things are not okay as they are. And then once again, we get into the perspectives of the relative and the absolute. In this relative world, there is suffering that is caused by injustice and intolerance and cruelty of various kinds. That we may well want to do something about. I think what this is suggesting to us is that in our practice, we simply do the practice without trying to get something. And when we're in the world and we're working, say, to build bridges or to stop injustice, or frankly just to stop something from happening that should be stopped, that we do our effort and we do whatever we can as best we can without grasping at the way it needs to come out in the end. Some of that's pretty, well, I'll leave that where it is. And just also, I think I'll read a little bit from Trelig also. Our friend Trelig Kabgan. He says, give up all hope for results. This slogan may sound foreign to Western ears, but it has a long history in Buddhist thinking. The lojong teachings say that whenever we become obsessed with results, we spend our time trying to manipulate the outcome of our endeavor instead of paying attention to the activity itself. I think that's such a really good point. When we're focused on how we need to have it come out, we're trying to manipulate the outcome, where we'd be better served by just paying attention to what we're doing. Even though we have no real idea of what the result will be, we project a picture-perfect vision of our expectations into the future. This distracts us from doing the task at hand, and usually ends in frustration and disappointment because the imagined result is never the same as the eventual outcome. Have you noticed? You know, you start a project, you think you know how you want it to be, whether it's something physical or making a garden, or whether it's something in your spiritual life or in a relationship, and you have this idea of how you want it to be, but it doesn't turn out that way. Sometimes it turns out better. Sometimes things seem to fall apart. So, usually ends up in frustration and disappointment because the imagined result is never the same as the eventual outcome. Thus, we shouldn't concern ourselves with what benefits we're achieving from our mind training. So he hones down on what we're doing now. But should simply focus on our practice with sincerity. For how we engage in the practice is what will determine the end result. If we're doing Tonglen, to do it with the idea that we're going to change someone, or even change our own attitude about someone, they're saying, it doesn't help. Just do the exchange. Do the taking and sending. Just do it. Don't try to have something in particular happen. Just do the practice. It's very simple, although not in keeping with how we usually look at things. It's important to have a general notion of what we want to attain. But we shouldn't get too caught up in specifics or we'll waste our time and energy in fantasies. If we want to become great in the future, we need to do great things now, for thinking about the future only robs us of the future. Sounds to me like he's getting a little bit into some wanting results here. But whether we're pursuing a worldly goal or a spiritual one, such as keeping our lojong commitments, it's important to give up hopes for any imagined result. And I'll stop there. I was thinking of talking some about giving up poisonous foods, but I think I'll do that next time around. So let me reverse the process here. We'll stop the recording.